The ask, it was $25 billion. But the joint staff team and the comptroller team are constantly looking at that estimate. And so now we think it's closer to 29. That's because of updated repair and replacement of equipment costs and also just general operational.
$29 billion. That's what the Pentagon just told Congress the war in Iran has cost so far. $29 billion in how long? You ask? They didn't exactly clarify. But here's what makes this number absolutely fascinating and deeply confusing. Less than 2 weeks earlier, the Pentagon said the war had cost $25 billion. That's a $4 billion jump in under 14 days. And here's the part that should make everyone stop and do the math. Back in March, a source told Reuters the first 6 days of the war alone cost $11.3 billion. Read that again. 6 days, $11 billion. So if the opening week of combat burned through $11 billion, how is the total figure months later? Only $29 billion? Either the war dramatically slowed down after those first 6 days, or someone's math isn't adding up. And in a briefing where a Pentagon comptroller stood next to the defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and said, "We're constantly looking at that estimate," nobody asked the obvious question. How did you arrive at this number? Because according to the Reuters report, quote, "It is unclear how the Pentagon arrived at the $29 billion figure." Unclear. That's the word they used. This isn't a small discrepancy. This is the cost of a war involving the United States military, American equipment, and potentially American lives. And the accounting method is unclear. Now, if this were just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it might not matter that much. But this is happening 6 months before the midterm elections. Democrats are riding high in the polls, and they're tying this war directly to cost of living issues. Republicans are defending a war that's becoming more expensive by the day, with numbers that don't seem to hold up under scrutiny. And the American public is being asked to trust institutions that can't clearly explain how they're spending tens of billions of dollars. So what's really going on here? Is this a case of bureaucratic confusion, political spin, or something more deliberate? By the end of this video, you're going to understand not just what the Pentagon said, but what they didn't say, why the timing matters more than most people realize, and what this reveals about how wars are sold, funded, and justified in the modern era. Because this isn't just about Iran. It's about what happens when the cost of conflict becomes a political weapon, and the truth becomes negotiable. Let's break it down. The headline that came out of that Tuesday briefing was simple and stark. The war in Iran has now cost $29 billion. Jules Hurst, performing the duties of the comptroller, delivered the update to lawmakers alongside Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Hurst explained that the new figure included updated repair and replacement of equipment, plus operational costs. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Wars cost money. Equipment gets damaged. Operations require fuel, logistics, personnel support, intelligence infrastructure. The Pentagon is simply updating Congress as the bills come in. That's the official story. And to be fair, this kind of cost revision is not unusual in wartime. Early estimates are rough. Real costs emerge over time as invoices get processed, contracts get fulfilled, and damage assessments get completed. In the chaos of conflict, you're not stopping to tally every dollar before you launch the next sortie. So a $4 billion increase in 2 weeks? Plausible, if you're still accounting for the early days of the war. But here's where the narrative starts to crack. The Pentagon's April 29th estimate was $25 billion. That was roughly a month ago. And now it's $29 billion. That $4 billion gap is supposed to cover updated repair and replacement of equipment and operational costs. But what about everything that happened before April 29th? If the first 6 days cost over $11 billion, that means in the time between day 6 and late April, let's call it several weeks, at least the war only cost an additional $14 billion. Think about that ratio. The opening salvo, $11 billion in 6 days. Everything after that, for weeks, $14 billion total. That's a dramatic slowdown in spending, which could mean the war shifted from high-intensity operations to a lower tempo. Or it could mean the accounting methods are inconsistent. Or it could mean the 11 billion figure was inflated. Or the 29 billion figure is understated. We don't know. Because the Pentagon didn't explain the methodology. And lawmakers, apparently, didn't press them on it. What we do know is this. The war is politically toxic. President Trump's Republicans are facing a tough fight to hold the House in the upcoming midterms. Democrats have made the war in Iran a centerpiece of their campaign strategy, linking it directly to inflation, gas prices, and the cost of living. And every time the Pentagon revises the cost upward, that's another talking point for the opposition. So the timing here is not neutral. This is a briefing that happened in the middle of an election cycle, with enormous political stakes, and the numbers being presented are both significant and vague. That's not an accident. That's the environment in which this information is being delivered. Now, let's talk about the part that most people scrolled past. The part buried in the middle of the Reuters article that should have been the headline. Quote, "It is unclear how the Pentagon arrived at the $29 billion figure." Unclear. Not disputed. Not estimated using standard models. Unclear. That's a polite way of saying we asked. And they didn't give us a straight answer. So what does that mean in practice? It means we don't know if the $29 billion includes the full cost of munitions already expended, or just the replacement cost. We don't know if it includes long-term maintenance on equipment that was damaged but not destroyed. We don't know if it includes hazard pay for personnel, or medical costs for wounded service members, or contractor fees for private logistics firms. We don't know if it includes intelligence-gathering costs, cyber operations, or support for allied forces. We don't know if it includes the cost of repositioning assets that were pulled from other theaters. We don't know if it's accounting for depreciation, or just raw expenditure. In other words, the number could be accurate, or it could be a fraction of the real cost, and the Pentagon isn't clarifying. Jules Hurst said the Joint Staff Team and the Comptroller Team are constantly looking at that estimate, constantly looking at it, not constantly refining a transparent formula, not updating Congress with clear line-item breakdowns, just looking at it. That phrasing is deliberate. It sounds active. It sounds responsible. But it doesn't actually tell you anything. And here's why that matters more than it might seem. When the costs of a war are unclear, the debate about whether the war is worth it becomes impossible to have, honestly. If you don't know what you're spending, you can't evaluate the return on investment. You can't compare it to other national priorities. You can't make an informed decision about whether to continue, escalate, or withdraw. You're just flying blind, trusting that the people in charge have it under control. And historically, that trust has not always been well placed. The Iraq War was initially sold as a conflict that might cost $50 to $60 billion total. The final price tag, depending on how you count, was somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion. The Afghanistan War? Similar story. Early estimates were modest. Final costs were staggering. So when the Pentagon stands in front of Congress and says, "We're constantly looking at the estimate," but can't explain how they arrived at the current number, that's not just a bureaucratic quirk. That's a red flag. It suggests either incompetence or intentional obfuscation, and neither option is reassuring. Let's dig into the timeline, because that's where the story gets even stranger. A source tells Reuters the first 6 days of the war cost at least $11.3 billion. April 29. The Pentagon says the total cost so far is $25 billion. May 12. The Pentagon revises that to $29 billion. So from the first 6 days to late April, the cost went from $11 billion to $25 billion. That's an increase of $14 billion over a period of roughly 6 to 8 weeks, depending on when exactly the war started. Then, in less than 2 weeks, it jumps another $4 billion. That $4 billion increase in under 2 weeks is nearly a third of what was spent in the previous 6 to 8 weeks. What happened in those 2 weeks? Did operations suddenly intensify? Did a major piece of equipment get destroyed and need replacing? Did the Pentagon finally get around to accounting for costs they'd missed earlier? We don't know, because Hearst's explanation updated repair and replacement of equipment and operational costs applies to literally everything. That's not an explanation. That's a category. Now, let's be fair for a moment. Military accounting is genuinely complex. When you're operating across multiple domains: air, sea, land, cyber, space with coalition partners, forward bases, and supply chains stretching across continents. The costs don't come in neatly. A missile fired in week 1 might not get invoiced until week 6. Equipment damage might not get assessed until after a unit rotates out. Contractor costs might be billed on a 30-day cycle. So some lag and revision in the numbers is expected. But here's the thing. The Pentagon has been doing this for a long time. They have cost estimation models. They have historical data from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and dozens of other operations. They know, roughly, what an air campaign costs per day. They know what a carrier strike group costs to operate. They know what precision-guided munitions cost per unit. So for the methodology to be unclear suggests one of two things. Either this war is being conducted in a fundamentally different way that breaks the traditional models, or the Pentagon is being deliberately vague because clarity would be politically inconvenient. Given the timing 6 months before midterms, the latter seems more likely. So, let's zoom out and talk about the bigger strategy behind all of this. Not the military strategy in Iran. The political strategy around the war's cost. Because numbers aren't neutral. The way costs are presented, the timing of updates, The level of detail provided all of that as a choice. And those choices reveal priorities. Think about it. If the Pentagon wanted to be maximally transparent, they could release a detailed breakdown. Line items, categories, methodologies. They could explain exactly what's included in the $29 billion and what's not. They could clarify whether this is just direct combat costs, or if it includes broader strategic repositioning. They could compare this to other recent conflicts to give context, but they didn't do any of that. Instead, they gave Congress a single number, a vague explanation, and a promise that they're constantly looking at it. Why? Because precision invites scrutiny. If you say we spent $2 billion on munitions, $3 billion on fuel, $5 billion on personnel, and $4 billion on equipment replacement, people can start asking questions. Why so much on munitions? What got destroyed? Was it worth it? But if you just say $29 billion updated costs, it's much harder to challenge. The number is big enough to sound serious, but vague enough to avoid accountability. And, politically, that vagueness serves everyone. For Republicans defending the war, a higher number justifies the seriousness of the threat. We spent $29 billion because Iran was a major national security challenge for Democrats attacking the war. A higher number justifies the criticism. We spent $29 billion on a war that didn't need to happen. Both sides can use the same number to support opposite narratives, and that's only possible because the number itself is unclear. If the Pentagon provided detailed, transparent accounting, one side would have to be wrong. But with vague figures, everyone gets to claim they're right. Now, there's another layer to this. The war in Iran isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at a time when military budgets are under increasing scrutiny. The defense budget is approaching $1 trillion. Annually, when you include all the supplemental spending and off-book costs. And Americans are increasingly asking whether that money could be better spent elsewhere. Infrastructure, healthcare, education, debt reduction. The cost of the Iran war, whatever it actually is part of that larger debate. If the true cost is significantly higher than $29 billion, that strengthens the argument for restraint. If it's actually lower, or if the $29 billion prevented a much larger conflict, that strengthens the argument for continued engagement. But without clear numbers, the debate can't really happen. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the ambiguity is the strategy. Keep the numbers vague enough that both sides can claim vindication, and the public can't form a clear judgment. Now let's talk about the other side of the story, the part that often gets ignored in these debates about cost. Because there's an argument, one that supporters of the war would absolutely make that focusing purely on dollar. Figures misses the bigger picture. Wars aren't business transactions. You don't evaluate them the same way you'd evaluate